In 1907, the American financial system came within hours of total collapse. Banks locked their doors. Depositors pounded on the glass. The nation's trust in money, the invisible glue of capitalism, began to dissolve. And then, in an act that looked almost mythic, one man walked into the void. J.P. Morgan. A private banker, not an elected official, not a regulator. Yet in that moment, he became the central bank of the United States. The panic began quietly, as they always do. A failed speculation here, a run on the trust company there. But within days, it spread like fire through dry grass. Money vanished from circulation. Credit froze. Wall Street, the symbol of American ambition, suddenly became a place of fear. Newspapers called it a financial heart attack, and they weren't far off. The arteries of the economy were clogged with distrust. At first glance, this was a banking crisis, but beneath it lay something deeper, a structural flaw in how money itself was organized. The United States had no central bank. The money supply depended on private decisions, not public design. Gold flowed in and out like a tide, and every panic exposed how fragile the shoreline really was. The system worked until confidence cracked. Now imagine a nation where the stability of the economy depends not on law, but on the character of one man. Morgan summoned the city's leading bankers to his library. The doors were locked. Hours passed. Decisions that would determine the fate of millions were made in the glow of lamplight, not in Congress, but in a private study. Some called it heroism. Others saw a coup in tailored suits. The newspapers celebrated him as a savior, but behind the applause was a quiet realization. When institutions fail, power flows to whoever can act, and Morgan acted. He stabilized the markets by controlling them. He stopped the panic by deciding who lived and who didn't. The event exposed not only the fragility of finance, but the hierarchy hidden inside capitalism itself. Because the Panic of 1907 wasn't just a crisis, it was a transfer of trust, of authority, of sovereignty from the public to the private. The government watched, Wall Street obeyed, and Morgan ruled. If this opened another side of history for you, tell me where you're watching from. At the dawn of the 20th century, America stood on a knife's edge between chaos and empire. The railroads stretched from coast to coast, steel production surpassed Britain's, and Wall Street had become the heartbeat of global finance. Yet behind this industrial triumph hid an archaic monetary system, fragmented, regional, and dangerously unstable. The United States, unlike Europe, had no central bank. Since the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, financial order depended on private banks, each issuing its own notes, each guarding its reserves. Money in practice was whatever people trusted to circulate. That trust was thin. When fear rose, everyone demanded gold, and the system cracked. The national currency itself was backed not by the state, but by bonds. A national banknote was only as strong as the government debt behind it. When those bonds fluctuated, so did the foundation of money. It was a strange paradox. The more prosperous the nation became, the less stable its currency seemed. Because prosperity required credit, and credit in that era was not managed by Washington, but by Wall Street. New York was the nerve center. Dozens of private banks and trust companies collected deposits from across the country and lent them to industrialists, speculators, and railroad magnates. They operated with minimal regulation. The term trust didn't mean safety. It meant concentration. These institutions pooled money and influence, often beyond public scrutiny. In an age before the Federal Reserve, they were the liquidity system. And among them, one figure stood higher than the rest, John Pierpont Morgan. By 1907, he was 70 years old, cautious, deliberate, yet immensely powerful. His bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, wasn't the largest by assets, but it was unmatched in reputation. When Morgan spoke, the markets moved. When he refused to lend, companies collapsed. His influence was informal, but absolute. He was, as one journalist put it, the governor of American credit. The economy's growth masked its fragility. Industrial output surged, but it was financed by short-term borrowing. Speculators used borrowed money to buy stocks and copper mines. Banks lent against those assets, creating a web of leverage. Everyone depended on everyone else's solvency. The entire structure was efficient and brittle. Then came 1906. The San Francisco earthquake destroyed a city and triggered a wave of insurance payouts. Gold flowed out of New York to rebuild the West Coast. London tightened its credit in response. Interest rates rose and capital grew scarce. Like a stretched rope, the system began to strain. By early 1907, the markets were uneasy. A series of small scandals and over-leveraged ventures eroded confidence. Newspapers whispered about the trust companies, those fast-growing institutions outside the traditional banking rules. Their assets were vast, but their reserves thin. To the public, they looked like banks. In truth, they were more like high-risk investment machines, built on confidence, and confidence was evaporating. This was the atmosphere. A booming nation with no central backstop, a network of private financiers balancing on invisible credit lines, and a government too divided to intervene. The Treasury could inject gold, but not authority. The president could speak, but not command liquidity. The country had outgrown its financial tools, and as always happens in finance, the illusion lasted until one bet went wrong. Some historians call this period the age before the algorithm, when human judgment, not policy, controlled the flow of capital. But judgment is fallible. Greed and fear speak louder than reason when numbers turn red. The Panic of 1907 was not an accident of history. It was a stress test that revealed who truly owned the American economy. Because when the storm hit, it wasn't Washington that answered the call. It was Morgan's house on Madison Avenue. It began, as panics do, with a rumor that turned into a run. In October 1907, two ambitious speculators, F. Augustus Hines and Charles Morse, tried to corner the market in United Copper Company. They believed they could drive up its price, squeeze short sellers, and walk away rich. Instead, they triggered the first domino. When the scheme collapsed, investors rushed to withdraw money from the banks connected to them. One of those banks, the Mercantile National, was closely tied to the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's largest and most respected financial institutions. In a world built on confidence, guilt by association was fatal. Within hours, the Knickerbockers' deposits began to vanish. Lines of depositors stretched down Fifth Avenue. By the next afternoon, the Trust's president, Charles T. Barney, was forced to suspend operations. The number that mattered was not on a ledger, but in the crowd's eyes. Panic. As news spread, other trust companies faced runs of their own. The financial system, lacking a central source of liquidity, could not coordinate a response. Every banker was suddenly an island, defending his own reserves. Money fled from New York to the countryside, from small banks to private vaults, from the financial system into mattresses. And yet, it was not the failure of one company that endangered the economy. It was the absence of a mechanism to stop contagion. The U.S. Treasury could lend some funds, but it lacked flexibility. Gold shipments from Europe were too slow. Interest rates soared, reaching 70% in the call money market. Brokers could not finance trades. Stocks plunged. Even the New York Stock Exchange teetered on closure. What does that mean in real terms? When call money disappears, Wall Street ceases to function. Shares cannot be bought or sold. Companies cannot raise capital. And because every loan was linked to another, failure spread like infection. By late October, the entire American credit system was paralyzed. In that vacuum, one man stepped forward, J.P. Morgan, the private citizen who had both the liquidity and the authority to act. But authority in that moment meant something unusual, the ability to impose order by personal will. Morgan summoned the heads of the major banks, the presidents of the trust companies, and the Treasury's representatives. They met in his library, the same one where, decades earlier, he had built the first industrial monopolies. The mechanism was improvised. Morgan inspected balance sheets by hand. He decided which banks would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. When the panic reached the stock exchange, he arranged emergency loans to keep trading open. He ordered his associates to stand firm, even as the market convulsed. One witness later recalled, "He was like a general commanding troops in the field, without hesitation, without fear." But this was not altruism, it was calculation. Morgan understood that the collapse of confidence was a threat not only to the economy, but to his own empire. If the financial system broke, so would the House of Morgan. To save one, he had to control both. For the public, this was salvation. For historians, it was revelation. The United States had no institution powerful enough to stabilize its own currency, except a single banker. The panic ended not through law, but through negotiation in a private residence. The trust companies reopened, the market recovered, depositors returned. But the cost was invisible. The acknowledgement that national stability could depend on private power. Some called it the birth of modern finance, others saw it as the proof of its fragility. Because what Morgan rescued was not trust in banks, but trust in himself. And when a nation's confidence rests on one man's judgment, the next crisis is only a matter of time. To understand why the panic of 1907 spread so quickly, we have to dissect the machinery beneath it, the invisible plumbing of early American finance. On the surface, banks seemed independent. In reality, they were bound together by a single thread: liquidity. Every national bank was required to hold reserves in gold or lawful money. Smaller regional banks, unable to store large amounts of cash, kept their reserves in correspondent banks in New York. Those New York banks, in turn, used that money to lend to brokers on Wall Street. The entire pyramid rested on confidence that withdrawals would never happen all at once. But when fear struck, the same structure that made credit abundant made panic unstoppable. Money flowed backward, violently. Here's how the contagion moved. Depositors, hearing rumors about a trust company's weakness, withdrew their funds. The trust called in its loans to replenish reserves. Borrowers sold assets to raise cash. Prices fell. Collateral lost value. More loans were recalled. It was a feedback loop, the first modern liquidity spiral. Each attempt to protect one institution weakened the system as a whole. In 1907, there was no Federal Reserve to act as lender of last resort, no discount window, no coordination. When the panic hit, the Treasury could only inject gold from its limited reserves, and only with congressional approval. The financial system was a marketplace of private promises, with no public backstop. When those promises cracked, chaos was rational. Morgan's intervention was, in effect, a manual simulation of a central bank. His team gathered financial statements, analyzed them overnight, and decided which institutions would receive emergency loans. The funds came from a consortium of private banks, organized, pressured, and guaranteed by Morgan himself. The process was crude but effective. He even went further. To prevent total collapse of the stock exchange, Morgan forced rival bankers to contribute to a collective rescue fund. Each was compelled to put aside ego and self-interest, or face the destruction of the entire market. The decision was not democratic, it was dictated, and that dictation worked. The panic subsided only when one man enforced unity. But the mechanism that saved the market also exposed its flaw. Stability required centralization. Without a central authority, the system could only stabilize through monopoly. And Morgan, for that brief moment, became the monopoly of last resort. Some historians later called this the private clearinghouse solution. It wasn't new. During earlier panics, groups of banks had issued clearinghouse certificates, paper substitutes for cash, backed collectively by their reserves. Morgan revived the practice in 1907, issuing millions of dollars worth to keep transactions moving. They were, in essence, emergency money, privately printed and publicly accepted. And here lies the paradox. The system that prided itself on individual enterprise survived only through collective improvisation. A free market, to endure, had to be temporarily suspended. The same capitalists who distrusted government intervention found themselves obeying a single financier's orders. It was capitalism's first quiet admission. Even markets need a master switch. The lesson was clear, though unspoken. Financial power flows not to the biggest balance sheet, but to whoever can coordinate fear. In 1907, that was Morgan. In later decades, it would become the Federal Reserve. Because when a nation learns that liquidity is not infinite, it always builds a machine to create it. When the smoke cleared, Wall Street looked calm again. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had shifted. The panic of 1907 ended, yet the structure of American finance was no longer the same. The immediate damage was immense. Dozens of banks and trust companies collapsed. Industrial output fell by nearly a third. Unemployment surged. Across the country, factories slowed to a halt as credit evaporated. Farmers couldn't ship goods, merchants couldn't restock. In New York alone, depositors had withdrawn more than $500 million in cash, an astronomical figure for the time. But the most significant loss was intangible: faith in the system's architecture. The public suddenly saw how fragile the invisible empire of credit really was. The revelation struck deep: the realization that the nation's financial security depended not on law or oversight, but on a handful of men acting voluntarily. Congress took notice. Within months, lawmakers launched investigations into the causes of the panic. The Pujo Committee hearings that followed would expose the inner workings of Morgan's financial web, the money trust. Through mergers, interlocking directorates, and quiet alliances, a few Wall Street houses controlled vast sectors of the economy: railroads, insurance, steel, and banking itself. The panic had not destroyed their power, it had clarified it. And yet, paradoxically, Morgan's dominance also paved the way for reform. Even his critics conceded that the crisis proved a need for a central coordinating authority. "We cannot depend forever on the heroism of individuals," one senator remarked. "We must institutionalize stability." That idea would evolve, 7 years later, into the Federal Reserve System. But that was only part of the reckoning. For ordinary Americans, the panic reshaped their perception of money itself. Banknotes, deposits, and checks, once symbols of modern progress, were now seen as potential traps. People hoarded gold again, the old and trusted metal. The return to cash became a psychological defense. In a single season, the country reverted to financial primitivism, as if progress had been an illusion. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, Morgan's prestige reached divine proportions. Newspapers hailed him as the savior of the Republic. Crowds gathered outside his mansion to cheer. Yet, within his own circle, he understood what few others did: that he had not saved the system. He had merely postponed its reckoning. "The danger is not gone," he reportedly told a colleague. "It's only hidden." Hidden, but transformed. The crisis consolidated power into fewer hands. Smaller banks merged or disappeared. The surviving trusts aligned themselves under larger institutions for protection. The result was a quieter, more centralized financial order, the early architecture of corporate America. Efficiency replaced diversity, coordination replaced competition, and with that consolidation came a new moral equation. Stability required control. Control required concentration. In saving the system, Morgan had also proved that democracy and finance were not always aligned. The public wanted safety, the financiers demanded freedom. The two could not coexist without tension. For historians, 1907 marked the end of the 19th century economy, an age of private money and fragmented credit. What rose in its place was the prototype of the modern monetary state: centralized, elastic, and politically necessary. The crisis had forced an evolution that no law had yet imagined. But evolution has a price. Each safeguard built to prevent chaos also increases dependence on the new center. Each intervention, however justified, weakens self-correction. What began as rescue becomes routine. What was once emergency becomes expectation. The Panic of 1907 did not just change banking. It changed the definition of responsibility. A century later, the language has changed, but the pattern remains. Then it was called a panic. Today we call it a liquidity crisis. The names evolve, the mechanics do not. In 1907, fear spread through telegrams and headlines. In 2008, it moved through fiber optics. The collapse of Lehman Brothers played the same role as the fall of the Knickerbocker Trust. Complex instruments replaced copper stocks, but the underlying disease, leverage without backstop, was identical. When confidence vanished, capital froze. Once again, private rescue preceded public policy, and once again the world discovered that even in a globalized century, financial stability still depends on concentrated power. Look closer. The Federal Reserve, born from the lessons of 1907, was designed to prevent another Morgan moment, a permanent institutional lender of last resort. Yet when the 2008 crisis erupted, the Fed found itself playing Morgan's role on a planetary scale. It summoned the banks, unlocked liquidity windows, guaranteed credit lines, and decided, case by case, who would survive. It wasn't called a meeting in a library anymore. It was a weekend in Washington. But the choreography was eerily familiar. Some historians call this the institutionalization of improvisation. The ability to stabilize markets through emergency measures has become the defining power of modern central banking. Quantitative easing, bailouts, asset purchases, each one a new form of clearinghouse certificate printed not by private hands, but by state authority. The difference is scale, not essence. The system that once depended on Morgan's personal credibility now depends on the credibility of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And yet, the psychological core is unchanged. Money remains trust made visible. When that trust falters, people don't look to the market. They look for a savior. In 1907, it was a man. In 2008, it was an institution. In both cases, the logic was the same: coordination through concentration. Even today, the mechanisms that were born from crisis continue to expand. The Fed, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, each operates with powers unthinkable in Morgan's time. They can create trillions with a keystroke. They can backstop global liquidity with a press release. But the more these powers are used, the more the system relies on them. Intervention becomes identity. And that's the paradox. The more we prevent panics, the more we guarantee that only centralized authority can manage them. A century ago, the absence of regulation caused fragility. Today, abundance of control creates it. Every rescue rewrites incentives. Every guarantee erodes discipline. The echoes of 1907 are everywhere. Then, a speculative boom in copper. Now, in technology and housing. Then, a web of trust companies beyond oversight. Now, shadow banks, hedge funds, crypto exchanges. Then, the illusion of diversification. Now, the illusion of decentralization. History doesn't repeat, it recalibrates. And once again, we find ourselves in a world where confidence is everything, and everything depends on confidence. The players are different, the tools digital, but the core dynamic remains hauntingly familiar. When the next panic comes, and it always comes, we will again turn to whoever can act fastest, not necessarily who was elected to act at all. Because control, once privatized, never truly returns to the public. It only changes form, changes name, and waits for the next emergency to reveal it. When the Panic of 1907 ended, America believed it had learned its lesson. It built the Federal Reserve to ensure that no single man would ever again decide the fate of the nation's money. But over a century later, we've come full circle. The names have changed, not the logic. Today, when markets tremble, we still wait for a single voice to calm them. A Fed chair's sentence can move trillions. A misinterpreted phrase can erase fortunes. The instruments are digital, but the faith is personal. We have replaced Morgan's library with press conferences and called it progress. It is tempting to see that as evolution. In truth, it may only be refinement. Every generation creates its own version of control, convinced that this time it is rational, institutional, safe. Yet every generation rediscovers the same fragility, the invisible thread of trust stretched between the public and those who hold liquidity. Imagine that moment in 1907 again. The locked doors, the sleepless bankers, the city waiting for a decision made behind walls of silence. Replace the gas lamps with screens, the gold ledgers with data feeds, and the image hardly changes. Crisis in finance is just the past repeating in a new dialect. Some historians say Morgan saved capitalism. Others say he revealed it. Both may be true. Because the real story of 1907 is not about money, it's about authority, about who acts when everyone else freezes. And that question has never been resolved. History doesn't repeat, it negotiates. It waits for us to believe again so it can test what we've built on faith.